The punishment, the great hall of the empire, was filled with silver banners and burning crystals that cast their light across the marble floor. It was a place of order and silence, but that day silence was broken by the sharp voice of the young Princess Lyra. She stood at the center of the chamber, her golden robe shimmering, yet her eyes burning with fire. The council had decided to support a war against a smaller world that resisted tribute, but Lyra spoke against it. She said the empire was blind, that blood would only bring more rebellion, that the people would never bow if treated like cattle. Her words cut through the air like a blade, and though many in the chamber lowered their gaze, her father the emperor did not. His face was carved from stone, unmoved by her pleas. When she had finished, a heavy silence fell, and everyone knew she had crossed a line. It was not her place to oppose the council. It was not her place to question her father, yet she had done so without fear. The emperor rose from his throne, his cloak dragging across the floor, and in that moment, Lyra felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her. He declared that her disobedience had shamed him before the council, and though she was his blood, she would not escape punishment. The punishment was unlike any she expected. He ordered that she be bonded in marriage to a human, one of the species the empire considered weak, rough, and unworthy of nobility. The words struck her like a blow. Her lips parted in disbelief. She thought she would be stripped of titles, or perhaps locked away from politics, but this was worse, far worse. To be bound to a human was to be mocked before all. The court gasped, some hid smirks behind their hands, others looked away with pity. Lyra stood frozen, her pride pierced deeper than any blade. The human was brought forward from the shadows of the hall. His name was Ethan. He was dressed in simple dark garments, his frame strong but not towering like the warriors of her people. His skin was pale compared to theirs, his eyes clear and steady, and though his clothes were plain, he carried himself as though the throne's judgment did not crush him. He did not bow to the emperor in fear, nor did he glare in anger. He simply stood with a calmness that unsettled those who expected trembling or desperation. Lyra's heart raced with fury. She wanted to spit venom, to demand that her father reconsider, to shout that she was no bargaining tool to be tied to a lesser being. Yet she knew the punishment was set, and to resist further would bring disgrace, not just on her, but on the bloodline itself. So she stood silent, though inside she screamed. Ethan's eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment, she felt a strange jolt. It was not attraction, it was not kindness, but a quiet recognition that he too was caught in a chain not of his own making. That unsettled her more than his steady face. After the hall emptied and the banner stopped swaying, Lyra was escorted to her chambers. Her attendants whispered behind her, speaking of the shame, the humiliation, the laughter that would spread across the palace walls. Lyra dismissed them all and stood alone before her mirror. Her reflection showed a woman born of fire and pride, yet her lips trembled as though she were a child again. She clenched her fists and swore that she would never let the human touch her, never let him near her heart. If this was to be her punishment, then she would endure it with iron walls around her soul. The next morning she was summoned to the garden court where Ethan was waiting. The space was filled with crystal trees and flowing streams, a place meant for harmony, but her mood was storm. She walked toward him with her chin high, every step a statement of her pride. Ethan turned to her with a faint nod, no bow, no words of false flattery. Lyra narrowed her eyes and asked if he understood the shame he had brought upon her. Ethan replied calmly that he had not asked for this bond, that he was here because the emperor's will was law, but he would not apologize for who he was. The words cut her in a way she did not expect. Most would cower before her title, but he spoke to her as though she were simply another soul before him. She laughed bitterly and told him that humans were fragile, that he would never last in a world like hers. Ethan only answered that fragility and strength were not opposites, that sometimes they were the same. Lyra felt her chest tighten with irritation and confusion. She turned away, telling herself he was nothing, yet his words lingered like an echo. That night she could not sleep. The empire outside her window glittered with 1,000 lights, but her mind burned with the humiliation of her father's judgment. Yet through that fire was another spark, the image of Ethan standing tall without fear. She tried to dismiss it as arrogance, yet deep inside a question whispered, was it arrogance, or was it something else? She closed her eyes, swore again she would never yield, never feel, and never fall. Still, sleep did not come easily. By the third day their bond was made official before the court. The Emperor's voice sealed their fate. Lyra stood beside Ethan, her face cold as stone, her body wrapped in ceremonial silk. She told herself this was not a union, only chains. Yet when Ethan's hand brushed hers during the rite, a strange warmth traveled up her arm. She pulled away quickly, her heart beating too fast. She told herself it was nothing, only nerves. But the truth followed her long after the ceremony ended. The punishment had been set, the bond sealed, the shame complete. But in the quiet corners of her heart, Princess Lyra felt something far more dangerous than shame. She felt the first tremor of a battle she had never been trained for. The battle between her pride and the strange human who stood beside her without bowing, without fear, and with a presence that made her question who truly held the power in their so-called punishment. The palace corridors stretched like rivers of glass and stone, their tall arches casting endless shadows. Princess Lyra walked ahead with her chin high, her long robes brushing the polished floor, while Ethan followed at a steady pace. It was their first day living together as the Emperor had commanded, and the arrangement was clear. They were to share a residence in the eastern wing of the palace where attendants and guards would watch every move. To Lyra this felt like exile, disguised as comfort, for the halls that once whispered of her royal freedom now spoke only of chains. When she entered the chamber prepared for them, she felt the sting of insult again. It was lavish, filled with crystal walls and soft light, but it was designed as a union suite for couples, with a single grand bed at its center. Her cheeks burned at the sight, and she turned sharply toward Ethan, declaring that he must sleep elsewhere. Ethan looked at the bed, then at her, and replied in calm words that he would not touch her space if she did not wish it, that he was not here to claim anything that was not freely given. Lyra expected mockery or fear, but instead she found herself disarmed by his restraint. She told herself it was only another act, another way for him to play dignity, and she resolved not to be fooled. Over the next days they clashed like storm and stone. She mocked the simplicity of his meals when he chose bread and fruit over the rich alien delicacies served by the attendants. She laughed when he trained with the palace guards and was pushed down in the sand ring, yet to her surprise he rose again each time, refusing to yield, and by the end of the week the guards themselves began nodding with respect at his persistence. She ridiculed his plain clothing and his unpolished manners, yet he never snapped back in anger. He listened, sometimes with a faint smile, sometimes with silence, as though her words were arrows bouncing against a shield he carried within himself. One evening while she was seated at the balcony overlooking the shining city, she heard a sudden spark and crack behind her. The lighting sphere that hung above their chambers sputtered and burst, scattering fragments and smoke. Lyra's eyes widened as the shard of heated crystal flew near her face, but before she could react, Ethan was there. His hand caught her wrist and pulled her away, his arm shielding her from the falling sparks. The scent of smoke filled the room, and for a moment she felt the solid weight of his chest against her back. Her heart hammered as she turned to face him. His hand still rested on her arm, firm yet gentle, and the warmth of his skin spread through her body like fire. She jerked away quickly, snapping that she had not asked for his help, but her voice trembled. That night she lay awake replaying the moment. The touch of his hand haunted her skin, and she hated herself for remembering it. She told herself it was only instinct, only reflex, nothing more, yet the truth gnawed at her pride. She had grown up in a world where touch meant power and command, but Ethan's hand had carried neither. It had carried protection, not dominance, and that difference unsettled her more than anything. The following day they were summoned to the grand dining hall where nobles from across the empire gathered. Lyra prepared herself with pride, dressed in garments of flowing silver threads, her hair braided with gems. She would not allow anyone to see weakness. Ethan walked beside her, wearing the same simple dark garments as before, and the nobles whispered behind jeweled masks. They called him primitive, an animal dressed in borrowed cloth, unworthy to walk beside their princess. Lyra clenched her jaw, ready to answer their sneers with icy words, but Ethan did not seem shaken. He moved with the same calm pace, his eyes scanning the hall as though he had walked among kings all his life. At the banquet, Lyra expected him to stumble over customs, but when the strange instruments of alien food were placed before him, he observed quietly and copied with careful grace. The nobles laughed under their breath, yet Ethan did not flinch. He ate slowly, treating the moment as though it were nothing unusual. Lyra found herself watching him more than the jeweled plates before her. She wondered why he did not fight back, why he did not glare, why he did not hide. His calmness made the whispers of the nobles seem hollow, their mockery small and brittle. After the feast, Lyra confronted him in their chamber. She demanded to know why he did not strike back with words, why he did not show anger when they humiliated him. Ethan answered that dignity was not something others could strip away with laughter, that his worth was not defined by their eyes, but by his own. Lyra stared at him, her lips parting without words. She had been raised to fight for honor, to cut down those who questioned her. Yet here stood a man who carried honor like a quiet flame inside him, untouchable by scorn. Her heart throbbed with confusion. She wanted to shout at him, to tell him that his calm was arrogance, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw no arrogance there, only a strange strength that made her chest tighten. She turned away quickly, ordering him to leave her be, but long after he left the chamber, his words echoed in her mind. Days passed, and though they still clashed, the air between them began to change. When he trained in the sand ring, she found herself watching longer than she intended, noticing the stubborn fire in his movements. When they walked through the palace gardens, she caught herself stealing glances at his steady hands as they brushed the leaves of the glowing trees. When he spoke, she listened, though she pretended not to. Every moment was a battle within her, for her pride demanded distance, yet something inside her wanted to draw closer. One evening, as the twin moons rose, and their light bathed the palace, Lyra stood on the balcony again. She thought of the shame her father had placed on her, the chains of her punishment, and the strange human who now lived at her side. She told herself she would never let him inside her heart, but as the wind carried his calm voice from within the chamber where he sat reading one of the Empire's scrolls, her chest ached with a truth she could no longer deny. Something had begun between them, something neither law nor pride could erase, and it frightened her more than the wrath of the Emperor himself. The fracture of the days in the palace became a quiet storm for Princess Lyra. She had sworn she would never bend to the punishment forced upon her. Yet with each sunrise she found her eyes drifting toward Ethan more often than she wished. She told herself it was curiosity, perhaps even irritation, but deep inside she knew it was something different. Still she built her walls high, for her pride was strong, and she feared what lay beyond those walls if they fell. But while her heart wrestled with confusion, the palace itself stirred with whispers of anger. Many nobles could not accept the idea of a human walking beside the bloodline of the Empire. To them, Ethan was a stain, a symbol of weakness, and they feared that his presence would embolden others to question tradition. Behind jeweled doors and hushed gatherings, plans were made. They would not strike openly against the Emperor's command, but they would find ways to break Ethan, to show the court that he was unworthy. It began subtly, with laughter behind his back, with servants moving slower to attend him, with gifts offered to Lyra while ignoring his presence. Lyra noticed but said nothing at first. She told herself it did not matter, that she cared nothing for his feelings. Yet one evening when she saw a group of young nobles block Ethan's path in the corridor, mocking his plain clothes and daring him to fight, her blood boiled. She had nearly stepped forward to cut them down with her words, but Ethan raised a hand and faced them with the same calm she had come to know. He answered nothing, simply walked past without bowing his head, and though they laughed louder, he did not falter. Lyra watched with narrowed eyes, realizing that the more they tried to belittle him, the taller he seemed to stand. Still the nobles grew bolder, for calmness was not enough to silence their pride. When a grand banquet was announced in the Emperor's hall, they saw their chance. This would be the night to crush the human before the eyes of the court. The hall glittered with crystal lights and golden vessels, and Lyra entered with her usual poise, dressed in radiant silks that shone like fire. Ethan walked beside her, simple in his dark garments, yet holding himself as though he belonged among the nobles who despised him. The feast began with music and laughter, but beneath the sound was tension as sharp as a blade. Lyra felt it, and so did Ethan. The nobles watched him like hunters watching prey. When the ceremonial wine was poured, a servant loyal to their scheme slipped a drop of pale poison into Lyra's cup, meant not to kill but to sicken her before all, to shame her by showing that her human could not even protect her at his side. The cup was lifted and placed before her, its surface catching the glow of the flames. Lyra reached for it, unaware, but Ethan's hand moved quickly. He caught her wrist just as she lifted it, his eyes narrowing. She turned to him in surprise, ready to scold him for daring to stop her in public, but his gaze was fixed on the cup. Without a word he took it from her hand and raised it to his lips. The nobles gasped, some smiling as though their victory had come sooner than expected. Lyra's heart raced as he drank. Moments passed, the hall watching in silence. Then Ethan lowered the cup, his face calm, though a faint strain passed across his eyes. Lyra saw it, though others did not, and her stomach twisted with dread. The Emperor himself demanded to know what had happened, his voice thunderous. Ethan bowed his head slightly, not in submission but in respect, and said that the wine had been tampered with. Gasps filled the chamber. The nobles shifted uneasily. The Emperor's face grew dark, and he ordered the guards to seize the servant who had delivered the cup. The man trembled, tried to flee, but was dragged forward. Under pressure he confessed, naming the nobles who had plotted the scheme. The hall erupted in shock as the truth spilled into the open. Through it all, Lyra stood frozen, her eyes on Ethan. She realized what he had done. He had placed himself between her and shame, drinking the poison to protect her before all. Her chest ached with a strange and dangerous warmth. She wanted to speak, but words failed her. He had not asked for glory, had not demanded recognition. He had simply acted, without fear for his own body. Later that night, after the banquet ended, and the guilty nobles were punished, Lyra entered their chamber to find Ethan seated quietly. His face was pale, his breath uneven, but he did not complain. He had forced the poison from his body with sheer endurance and a remedy given by the healers, but it had left him weakened. Lyra's steps slowed as she approached. For a long time, she said nothing, watching him with eyes that betrayed the storm inside her. Then, almost against her will, she asked why he had done it. Ethan lifted his gaze to hers, and answered simply that he would not let her be shamed, that no one deserved such betrayal. and that if his presence meant anything, it was to stand beside her when others sought to tear her down. Lyra's lips trembled. She turned away, unable to let him see the emotion burning in her eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt a crack inside the walls she had built around her heart. The following days were heavy with change. Whispers spread across the palace, but they were no longer whispers of mockery. They spoke of the human who had drunk poison without fear, the human who had stood in defense of the princess when her own guards had failed. Some still despised him, but others began to look with new eyes. Lyra herself felt the shift, most of all. She no longer looked at Ethan as punishment, nor as humiliation, but as something far more dangerous. He had become a question she could not answer, a flame she could not put out. One evening she walked through the gardens with him in silence. The stars burned above, casting silver light across the crystal trees. She wanted to speak, to tell him what stirred in her heart, but her pride held her tongue. Instead, she glanced at him from the corner of her eyes, studying the calm lines of his face, the quiet strength in his walk. And as the night stretched on, she knew with a certainty that frightened her more than any punishment. She no longer hated the human at her side. She feared she was beginning to need him. The awakening, days after the banquet, carried a new weight for Princess Lyra. The memory of Ethan lifting the poisoned cup from her hand did not leave her. She could still feel the warmth of his fingers against her wrist, still see the calm fire in his eyes as he drank. It unsettled her more than the whispers of the court, more than the punishment that had bound them. She had lived her life surrounded by warriors who boasted of strength, nobles who fought for pride, and courtiers who bowed to power, yet never had she seen anyone like him. He was not strong in the way her people defined strength, yet when he acted, it was as though nothing could move him. At night, she found herself pacing her chamber, torn between anger and longing. She told herself she hated the way he had changed her thoughts, yet her heart beat faster whenever his voice reached her ears. She lay awake, remembering how he had shielded her from the shards of crystal, how he had faced her father's nobles without fear, how he had swallowed pain with silence. These memories burned in her chest, and she could not escape them. One evening the storm came. The Empire's fleets had been stretched thin by rebellions across the outer worlds, and raiders found their chance. A band of enemies broke through the defense lines and attacked the palace itself. Sirens wailed through the night, the sky above flashing with fire as ships clashed in orbit. Guards rushed through the corridors, steel clashing against intruders who had forced their way inside. Lyra was led quickly toward a safer chamber, but the battle reached them sooner than expected. The corridor shook with blasts and smoke filled the air. From the shadows emerged raiders clad in black armor, their blades glowing with crimson energy. The guards fought, but the enemy pressed hard. Lyra stood back, her heart pounding, when one of the raiders broke through the line and charged at her. Before she could raise her defense, Ethan was there. He seized a fallen spear from the floor, and with a raw strength that surprised even her, he struck the attacker back. The clash rang in her ears, and she felt her chest tighten at the sight of him standing between her and death. They were forced to retreat through twisting corridors, smoke and fire chasing them. The guards fell one by one until only a few remained. And then even they were scattered. Lyra and Ethan ran together into the lower halls where the palace walls had cracked under the assault. Debris blocked their path, and they found themselves trapped in a chamber lit only by the flickering light of broken crystals. Outside, the storm of battle raged, but inside there was silence broken only by their heavy breaths. Lyra leaned against the wall, her arm bleeding from a shallow cut. Ethan knelt beside her, tearing a strip from his garment to bind the wound. She wanted to tell him to stop, to remind him she did not need his help, but when his hand pressed gently against her skin, the words died on her lips. His touch was steady, his movements careful, and she felt warmth spread through her body that had nothing to do with blood or pain. She looked at him and found herself trembling. Her pride fought to rise, to shout at him, yet her voice broke in a whisper. She asked him why he did this, why he risked himself again and again for her. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the flickering light. He said he could not stand by while she suffered, that he cared not for titles or punishments, only for the person she was behind the crown. Lyra's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like this. To others she was always the princess, the heir, the daughter of the emperor. To him she was simply Lyra, a woman whose heart he saw even. Through her walls the silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. She felt her chest burn, her pulse racing in her throat. She wanted to turn away, but her body leaned closer. Her hand lifted without thought and brushed against his. The spark that ran through her skin was so fierce she gasped. She pulled back. Quickly, her pride roaring inside her, and she stood, her voice rising in anger. She demanded he keep his distance, that he had no right to speak of her heart. Yet her voice shook, and he saw the truth beneath her anger. Ethan did not move closer. He did not press her, did not claim victory. He only spoke softly, saying he would never force her, that whatever she chose was her own will. Those words struck her deeper than anything else. In her world, choice was rare, freedom was bound by duty, but here was a man who could have taken advantage of her weakness and instead gave her power over herself. That power terrified her because it made her want him all the more. The hours passed as the storm outside raged and faded. They remained in the broken chamber, the air thick with tension neither dared to break. Lyra sat with her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes drawn to him even when she tried to look away. Ethan rested against the wall, his gaze steady, his presence calm despite the chaos around them. Each moment together tightened the bond she had sworn to reject. She felt desire blooming inside her like a flame, fierce and consuming. A flame she did not know how to control. When at last the guards found them and led them back to safety, Lyra walked beside Ethan in silence. Her body still trembled from the memory of his touch. Her mind still burned with the sound of his words. She told herself she would bury the feelings, that she would build her walls higher, yet deep inside she knew the truth. The punishment that had once shamed her had become the bond she feared most, because it was no longer chains. It was choice. That night in her chamber she stood before the mirror again. She saw the reflection of a princess dressed in silk, but she no longer recognized the coldness in her own eyes. Something had changed, something she could not undo. She pressed her hands to her chest and whispered to herself that she could not fall, that she must not, but her heart thundered louder than her words. For the first time in her life, she was not afraid of war, not afraid of shame, not afraid of her father's wrath. She was afraid of the human who had touched her not with command but with care, and of the desire that now threatened to consume her. The Union, the palace, stood wounded after the storm of battle, its crystal walls cracked and scarred, yet the empire itself remained unbroken. In the days that followed, order returned to the halls, but peace was a fragile veil stretched thin over simmering unrest. The nobles who had plotted against Ethan during the banquet had been punished, but their families whispered still, and many in the court whispered too. They said the emperor had gone too far in binding his daughter to a human, that the empire would lose its honor if such a bond continued. For them, the raid by enemies was proof that weakness had entered their house. The emperor, though stern and proud, understood the storm building around him. To preserve unity, he called for the council once again. In the chamber where Lyra had first spoken against war, the emperor declared that the bond between his daughter and the human would be annulled. Lyra would be freed from the punishment and restored to her place among the nobility, and Ethan would be dismissed quietly, given safe passage to live elsewhere far from the heart of the empire. When the words reached Lyra, her heart twisted. This was what she had once begged for, what she had once thought she wanted, yet now the thought of it filled her with dread. She paced her chamber, her hands trembling. Images of Ethan standing in fire, of Ethan shielding her from shards, of Ethan drinking poison in silence, of Ethan tending her wounds, filled her mind. Every act he had given her was not forced, not demanded, not taken for pride. It was freely given, and she knew with certainty that if she let him go, she would lose more than a husband she had once hated. She would lose the only soul who had ever touched her heart as herself, not as princess, not as heir, but as Lyra. When the day came for the council to meet, the hall was filled with nobles and guards. The emperor sat upon his throne, his voice echoing as he spoke of the annulment. Ethan stood at the side, his posture calm though his eyes betrayed a quiet sadness. Lyra entered dressed in flowing white silk, her head high, her step steady. Yet her heart thundered with every beat. She reached the center of the chamber and turned not to her father, but to the council and the nobles who watched. Her voice rose, clear and strong, and she declared that the bond would not be broken. Gasps filled the air. The emperor's face hardened, demanding to know what she meant. Lyra raised her chin higher and said she no longer stood bound by punishment, but by choice. She claimed Ethan as her husband, not because the throne commanded it, but because her heart had chosen him. The chamber erupted in shouts, some in outrage, some in disbelief, and a few in awe. Before the emperor could speak again, the sound of steel rang from the outer halls. A faction of nobles who despised her words had risen in rebellion, their armed men storming the chamber itself. Guards clashed with rebels, and chaos filled the great hall. The emperor drew his blade, the council scattered, and in the storm of battle Lyra and Ethan stood side by side. Ethan seized a fallen weapon, his movements sharp and unyielding. He did not fight with the polished skill of her people, but with raw determination, striking with the persistence of one who would never fall until his body gave out. His courage lit a fire among the loyal guards who rallied around him. Lyra herself took up her ceremonial blade, the gems on its hilt catching the glow of the flames, and she cut down those who dared to threaten her father. Together they fought, their movements a rhythm born not of training but of trust. The rebels pressed hard, yet they had not expected such resistance. Ethan's ingenuity turned the tide. He used the broken shards of crystal walls to blind enemies, used overturned tables as barriers, and shouted commands that brought order where chaos threatened to drown them. The guards followed, inspired not by his rank, but by his will. Lyra felt the bond between them in every moment, a bond forged not by decree, but by battle and choice. When at last the last of the rebels were subdued, the hall stood in ruins. Blood stained the floor, and the banners hung torn, but the emperor still stood. He turned to his daughter and to the human who had fought beside her. His face was unreadable, carved of stone, yet behind his eyes flickered something new: recognition. Lyra stepped forward, her chest heaving with breath, and she spoke before all. She declared that the empire had seen truth this day, that tradition alone did not bring strength, that pride alone did not win battles. It was courage, honor, and unity that had saved them, and in Ethan she had found all three. She said she would no longer bow to punishment or to fear, and that she claimed Ethan as her husband by her own will. Silence fell, heavy and unbroken. Then slowly the emperor lowered his blade. He did not smile, he did not embrace them, but he did not speak. Against her, his silence was permission enough. The council and nobles, though many still burned with rage, could not challenge the daughter who had stood in blood and fire for her truth. In the days that followed, the rebellion was crushed and the empire healed. Ethan's name spread through the palace, not as mockery, but as legend. The human who had stood unbroken. Some still whispered against him, but many began to see him as a symbol, a reminder that worth was not bound to blood or crown but to spirit. On the night of their true union, Lyra stood in the garden court dressed in silver, the moons bathing her in light. Ethan stood before her, his hand reaching for hers. When their fingers touched, she felt again the warmth that had haunted her since the day of their punishment. But this time she did not pull away. She held his hand tightly, her heart steady. She looked into his eyes and saw not chains but freedom. Not shame but pride. Not punishment but choice. The princess who had once sworn she would never bend had found her strength not in walls, but in the courage to open her heart. The human who had been brought as punishment had become her partner, her equal, and her fire. Together they stood beneath the moons, husband and wife not by decree but by desire. And the empire itself would never be the same. The end.